The stench of blood and decay clung to my hands as I tightened a bandage around yet another soldier's mangled leg. His screams had faded to whimpers, a small mercy in this tent full of the dying. I, Peter Olin, once proud paladin in training, now reduced to a glorified field medic. As I moved to the next cot, memories of my interrupted training flashed through my mind. The cool stone halls of the sanctuary, the weight of holy tomes in my arms, the warmth of divine light during meditation. All of it felt like a distant dream now, washed away by rivers of blood and the acrid smoke of war. It had been 2 years since the elves launched their assault on our borders. 2 years since I cast aside my training robes and donned ill-fitting armor. I remember the day clearly standing before Master Thorn, my voice shaking as I told him I was leaving to join the fight. "You're not ready, Peter," he had said, his weathered face etched with concern. "A half-trained paladin is more danger than aid on the battlefield." But I wouldn't listen. How could I continue my studies while our people died? So I left, filled with righteous purpose and misplaced confidence. Now, as I wiped pus from a festering wound, I wished I'd heeded his words. What use was I here, with my stunted healing abilities and clumsy swordwork? I couldn't even call upon the light to ease these men's suffering. A commotion outside drew me from my self-pity. Shouting, the clash of steel, screams of alarm. I grabbed my sword, a poor replacement for the blessed blade I'd hoped to earn, and rushed out into the night. Elven raiders had breached our perimeter. Their lithe forms danced through our defenses, silver blades flashing in the moonlight. Magic crackled in the air, turning the night to day as fireballs rained down upon our tents. I raised my sword, uttering a prayer that felt hollow on my lips. 3 elves turned towards me, their faces masks of cold disdain. I parried the first strike more by luck than skill, the impact rattling my bones. The second elf flanked me, his blade slicing a line of fire across my ribs. I stumbled back, desperately trying to remember my training, but instead of divine inspiration, only fear flooded my mind. This was it. I was going to die, having accomplished nothing. A roar from behind me shook the ground. Captain Kingsman, a mountain of a man, charged into the fray. His massive warhammer sent one elf flying, skull crushed. The other 2 fell back, giving me a moment to catch my breath. "On your feet," Boy Kingsman bellowed. "If you can't fight, at least get the wounded out." Shame burning in my chest, I nodded and turned to the task. As the battle raged around me, I helped drag the injured to relative safety. My hands shook as I tried to staunch bleeding and bind wounds. All the while, the screams of the dying filled the air. By dawn, the raid had been repelled, but at a terrible cost. Half our camp lay in smouldering ruins. The moans of the injured mixed with the sobs of the bereaved. I stood amidst the carnage, my once white tunic stained red, and felt the weight of my failure pressing down upon me. Captain Kingsman approached, his face grim. "We can't take many more nights like this, lad," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "If something doesn't change soon, there won't be a human kingdom left to defend." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. He was right. We were losing this war, and my presence here seemed to make little difference. As the sun rose over the blood-stained field, I wondered how much longer we could hold out against the elven onslaught. The news came like a fever dream, whispered among the ranks with equal parts hope and disbelief. Orc war parties, attacking elven settlements. At first I dismissed it as desperate wishful thinking, the kind of rumor that spreads when men are pushed to their breaking point. But as the days wore on, the reports became more frequent, more detailed. Scouts returned with tales of elven outposts razed to the ground, of green-skinned berserkers cutting swaths through the enchanted forests our own armies couldn't penetrate. I remember the day Captain Kingsman summoned me to his tent. His face was haggard, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights spent poring over maps and reports. "Olin," he growled, "I need eyes I can trust on this. You're to lead a small team, verify these orc attacks." My stomach churned. "Sir, I'm no scout. Surely there are others more qualified." "There are," he cut me off, "but I need someone who can read the signs of battle, someone with at least a modicum of tactical training. That's you, boy, unless you'd rather I send you back to mopping up blood in the infirmary." The shame of that night still burned. I straightened my back and nodded. "When do we leave?" Dawn found me leading a group of 4 hardened veterans through the war-torn countryside. The irony wasn't lost on me, the half-trained paladin guiding seasoned warriors. But they followed without complaint, perhaps as eager as I was for some shred of hope. For days we moved in silence, avoiding elven patrols, following the trail of destruction. Burned homesteads, shattered wardstones, trees split by some immense force. This was no human handiwork. On the 5th day, we heard it, the unmistakable sound of battle, but different from what we knew. Guttural roars mixed with the high-pitched screams of elves. We crept forward, and I'll never forget the sight that greeted us. An elven outpost, one that had repelled human assaults for months, was under siege, but not by men. Orcs, massive and brutal, hurled themselves against elven defenses. Their crude weapons smashed through magical barriers, their sheer savagery overwhelming elven discipline. I watched, transfixed, as an orc chieftain at least 8 feet tall, muscles rippling beneath scars and crude tattoos, brought down an elven spellweaver. The delicate elf, all grace and poise, crumpled beneath the orc's iron-studded maul. By the light, whispered Thomas, one of my companions. It's true. They're actually doing it. I nodded, unable to speak. This was salvation, yes, but at what cost? The orcs showed no mercy, no quarter. They slaughtered elf children alongside warriors, burned precious tomes and works of art. This wasn't war as we knew it, this was annihilation. As night fell and the elven outpost burned, we made our way back to our lines. The knowledge we carried felt like a physical weight. Yes, the orcs were attacking the elves, buying us a precious respite. But they were no allies. Their savagery knew no bounds, respected no treaties. We were losing the war until the orcs arrived. Now, watching Captain Kingsman's face as I delivered my report, I realized a terrible truth. We might survive this war, but the world that emerged from it would be forever changed, and not, perhaps, for the better. As murmurs of excitement spread through the camp at the news, I retreated to my tent. I tried to pray, to find some guidance in the teachings I'd left behind. But as the sounds of celebration grew outside, I found only silence from the heavens. The change in our fortunes was as swift as it was unexpected. With the elves now fighting a war on 2 fronts, we found ourselves, for the first time in years, on the offensive. The taste of victory, however small, was intoxicating to our beleaguered forces. I watched as our tactics shifted, became more aggressive, more ruthless. Gone were the days of defensive posturing and cautious maneuvering. Now we struck hard and fast, taking advantage of every opening the orcs unwittingly provided us. One crisp autumn morning, I stood at Captain Kingsman's side as he outlined our most ambitious assault yet. We were to strike at the heart of an elven stronghold, one that had long been a thorn in our side. The plan was daring, relying heavily on the distraction provided by an expected orc attack from the opposite direction. As I listened, a cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't the honorable combat I'd envisioned when I left the sanctuary. This was opportunism, verging on barbarism. Sir, I ventured, my voice barely above a whisper. Is this right? Using the orcs like this, we're no better than. Then what? Olin Kingsman cut me off, his eyes hard. Better than dead. Because that's what we'll be if we don't seize this chance. Your paladin vows won't mean much when the elves are dancing on our graves. I fell silent, chastened but unconvinced. The battle itself was a blur of blood and fire. I found myself in the thick of it, my sword no longer feeling so awkward in my hands. We pushed forward, relentless, as the sounds of orc cries echoed from the other side of the elven defenses. I saw things that day that will haunt me forever. Elven warriors, proud and ancient, cut down as they tried to defend 2 fronts at once, the desperation in their eyes as they realized they were outmatched. And worst of all, the savage joy on the faces of my fellow humans as we pressed our advantage. In one terrible moment, I found myself face to face with a young elven scout. He couldn't have been more than a century old, a mere child by their standards. Fear clouded his features as he raised his blade with shaking hands. Time seemed to slow. I saw myself reflected in his wide eyes, blood-stained, grim-faced, a far cry from the paladin I'd aspired to be. In that instant, I made a choice. I knocked his blade aside and struck him with the pommel of my sword. He crumpled, unconscious but alive. As I stepped over his body, I caught Kingsman watching me, his expression unreadable. The battle raged on, and for the first time in years we emerged victorious. The elven stronghold fell, its ancient walls finally breached. As our forces celebrated, I wandered the smoking ruins, the weight of our actions settling heavily on my shoulders. I found Kingsman standing atop a crumbled tower, surveying the battlefield. The glow of victory shone in his eyes, but there was something else there too, a weariness, a cost that couldn't be measured in land or lives. "We did it, lad," he said as I approached. "We've turned the tide." I nodded, unable to share in his triumph. "At what cost, sir? We're using the Orcs' brutality to mask our own. Is this what victory looks like?" Kingsman was quiet for a long moment. "War is ugly, Olin. It's messy and it's cruel. But it's also necessary. We do what we must to survive." As night fell and the fires of battle smoldered, I retreated to a quiet corner of the captured stronghold. I knelt, trying to reconnect with the divine light I'd once felt so clearly. But as I searched my heart, I found only shadows and doubts. We were winning the war, yes, but with each victory, with each compromise of the ideals I'd once held dear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were losing something far more precious than land or lives. As I rose, my prayers unanswered, I caught sight of my reflection in a shattered mirror. The face that looked back at me was a stranger's, hardened, scarred, eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with divine light. We were no longer losing the war. But as I turned away from my reflection, I wondered if we'd already lost something far more important. The war reached its zenith in the fading days of autumn. Our forces, emboldened by recent victories and hardened by years of conflict, pressed forward with a fervor that bordered on fanaticism. The elves, caught between our relentless advance and the savage onslaught of the Orcs, began to falter. I found myself at the forefront of our final push, no longer the hesitant, almost paladin, but a battle-worn veteran. The weight of my sword felt natural now, my armor a second skin. Yet with each life I took, each elven city that fell, a piece of my former self crumbled away. The decisive battle came at the foot of the Silverleaf Mountains, before the gates of Alindor, the last great elven stronghold. Our armies gathered, a sea of steel and determination. Across the valley, we could see the Orc hordes amassing, their war drums a constant, terrible heartbeat. As dawn broke, Captain Kingsman addressed the troops. His voice carried over the assembled thousands, filled with a grim certainty. "This is it, lads. The elves are cornered. Today, we end this war." A cheer went up, but I remained silent, my eyes fixed on the gleaming spires of Alindor. How many innocents sheltered behind those walls? How many centuries of culture and wisdom would be lost in our assault? The battle was chaos incarnate. 3 armies clashed in a maelstrom of blood and magic. Elven archers rained death from the walls, while their mages called down storms of fire and ice. Our forces surged forward, siege engines rumbling, while from the east, the Orc horde fell upon the elven flanks like a green tide of destruction. I lost count of the foes I faced, my sword rising and falling in a grim rhythm. An elven bladesinger fell before me, her song cut short. A young Orc, eyes wild with bloodlust, met his end on my blade. Friend or foe, it all blurred together in the madness of battle. As the sun reached its zenith, a great cry went up. The gates of Alindor had fallen. Our forces poured into the city, and I found myself swept along in the tide. The fighting in the streets was desperate, brutal. Wolves fought with the ferocity of a dying race, but it wasn't enough. By nightfall, it was over. Alindor, jewel of the elven realms, was ours. As our soldiers celebrated in the streets, I made my way to the great temple at the heart of the city. There, surrounded by the shattered remnants of ancient statues, I fell to my knees. "What have we done?" I whispered, my voice hoarse from shouting orders. "Light preserve us, what have we become?" A hand fell on my shoulder. I looked up to see Captain Kingsman, his armor dented and bloodied, his eyes reflecting the same weariness I felt in my soul. "It's over, Olin," he said softly. "We've won." But even as the words left his mouth, a new sound reached us. War horns, deep and resonant, echoing from the direction of our homeland. Horror dawned on Kingsman's face as realization struck. "The Orcs," he breathed. "They're attacking our settlements now." In that moment, the true cost of our victory became clear. We had become so focused on defeating the elves, so reliant on the orcs' indirect aid, that we had left ourselves vulnerable. In our zeal to win the war, we had opened the door to an even greater threat. As we rushed to organize our weary troops for the long march home, I caught sight of my reflection in a polished elven shield. The face that looked back at me was a stranger's hard, scarred eyes haunted by the things I'd seen and done. Gone was the aspiring paladin, the idealistic young man who dreamed of serving the light. In his place stood a warrior, hands stained with the blood of two races, facing an uncertain future. We had won the war against the elves, yes, but as I turned away from my reflection and prepared to face this new threat, I realized the bitter truth: the real battle, the fight for the soul of our kingdom, and perhaps for my own soul, was only just beginning. Thank you so very much for listening to this story. I thoroughly hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe, leave a like, and comment too. I hope to see you on the next adventure.